Welcome to Dead Scary Stories. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share, and subscribe. Also, comment which story you thought was the scariest. Now lie back, relax, and let sleep consume you. The fitting rooms always smell the same, like stale fabric and plastic hangers. It's the kind of place you forget about as soon as you leave. A small, functional space tucked into the corner of the store, separated from the chaos by a set of beige curtains that never quite close properly. People come in, try their clothes on and leave. Nothing about it ever sticks in your memory. That's why I wasn't expecting to notice her. She came in during the evening shift, just after the store lights dimmed slightly to signal that we'd be closing soon. I'd been restocking clearance racks nearby, the kind of mindless task that lets your brain wander, and I only caught her out of the corner of my eye. She was about 16, maybe 17, with long, dark hair tied back in a ponytail. Her face was hard to read, focused maybe, or distracted, but she had an armful of clothes draped across one hand, a mix of colors and textures spilling from the hangers. She didn't look at me as she passed, just pushed her way through the curtain into one of the cubicles and let it swish shut behind her. The clothes swung on her arm as she disappeared, their hangers clicking faintly together like the sound of teeth. It was normal enough. Nothing about her stood out really, except for the way I kept noticing her after she was gone. Maybe it was the timing. Most people don't wander in to try things on right before we close. Or maybe it was the quiet way she moved, like she was trying not to leave a trace. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd left some kind of impression, though I couldn't put my finger on what. I went back to the clearance racks, tidying up the endless sea of mismatched items no one wanted, but my gaze kept drifting back to the fitting rooms. The curtain she'd disappeared behind was still closed, its hem brushing against the worn carpet like a waiting mouth. I thought I heard the faint sound of fabric rustling, but it might have been the air conditioning or the distant shuffle of someone pushing a trolley across the tiled floor. The minutes stretched on, 10, 15. Longer than anyone needed to try on a few jumpers and a pair of jeans. I told myself she was probably taking selfies or texting her friends. It wouldn't be the first time someone used the fitting rooms for something other than trying on clothes. Still, the longer she stayed, the more I felt that prickling awareness creeping up my neck, like a scratch I couldn't reach. When the store announcement crackled overhead, reminding customers that we'd be closing soon, I wandered over to the fitting rooms. There was no reason to think anything was wrong. I just wanted to check to see if she needed help or maybe nudge her towards finishing up. The curtain was closed the same way it had been when she went in. Nothing about it seemed off. I reached out, paused, and knocked on the edge of the frame. No response. Not even the faint sound of someone shifting inside, the way you'd expect if they were startled or about to call out. I stepped back, frowning. The other cubicles were empty, their curtains hanging open like yawning mouths. The fitting rooms were silent except for the soft, uneven hum of the air vent above me. I pulled the curtain back. The cubicle was empty. The hangers she'd been carrying were there, though. They'd been dumped onto the bench in a messy pile. The clothes draped haphazardly across the seat, as if they'd been thrown down in a hurry. The mirror opposite me reflected the tiny space perfectly. No girl, no sign of movement, nothing out of place except for the clothes. The cubicle wasn't large enough to hide in. There were no gaps beneath the bench or behind the mirror. The curtain hung straight to the ground, its edges undisturbed. It didn't make sense. I stepped into the cubicle, half expecting to feel the warmth of someone who'd only just left, but the air inside felt cool still, the way a room feels when it hasn't been touched for hours. I ran my hand across the pile of clothes, letting the fabric shift beneath my fingers. They felt normal, soft, slightly wrinkled where they'd been bundled together, nothing unusual. I stepped back, the curtain swaying faintly as it settled back into place, and looked around the fitting rooms again. There was no sign of her, not even the faint imprint of footsteps in the carpet leading away from the cubicle. The exit was visible from where I stood, but I hadn't seen anyone walk past. It was impossible to leave without being seen. I went to the nearest till where the supervisor was counting the till float and asked her to check the cameras. It didn't take long. The monitors in the back room are small and grainy, but clear enough to show what happened. The footage played in silence, the timestamp ticking away in the corner as the fitting rooms came into view. She was there. The cameras showed her entering with the clothes draped across her arm, the curtain swishing shut behind her. She didn't come out. The minutes dragged on, one after the other, the curtain trembling faintly as if caught by a draft. But there was nothing else. No movement, no sign of her slipping out. When the recording ended, the cubicle was empty. I stayed late that night, helping the closing team tidy up and check the stockroom for anything unusual. It didn't feel right, going home while that space lingered in the back of my mind. That empty cubicle that felt less like a room and more like a hollow. The clothes she'd carried in were gone when I returned to the fitting room. I don't know who moved them. When I asked the others, they just shrugged, their faces blank and tired. Someone probably put them back on the racks, they said. Someone always cleans up. I checked the cubicle one last time before leaving. The curtain hung still and pale against the dull carpet. The mirror reflected my face back at me, stretched and unfamiliar in the fluorescent light. I stared into it for longer than I should have, waiting for something to move behind me, waiting for an answer. Nothing came. The vest is a perfect fit. They leave them hanging in the break room, clean and pressed, with name tags clipped neatly to the chest. No one notices when I take one. Why would they? Everyone's rushing to clock in or out, their minds elsewhere. I know how to blend in. The store's busy, but not chaotic. There's that low hum of voices, the clatter of trolleys, the faint beep of checkout scanners. It's like static, a constant background noise that soaks into everything. I prefer it this way. When it's crowded, nobody pays attention to anything outside their immediate bubble. Shoppers wander through aisles, distracted by sales signs and discount stickers. Employees dart between them, stocking shelves or answering questions. It's the perfect environment, too much movement for anyone to notice me moving with purpose. I've been here for hours. Timing is everything, and I've learned patience. I wait, hands tucked into the pockets of the vest, pretending to straighten shelves or pull an item forward. Nobody looks twice at me. The fluorescent lights buzz faintly overhead, washing everything out, making faces look tired and pale. I scan the aisles carefully, studying the ones who pass by. I'm not interested in most of them. Too old, too big, too loud. But then there's her. She's not much older than a child herself. Thin and frazzled, pushing a trolley with a toddler sitting in the basket. The boy is small, probably 3, maybe 4. He's got a mop of dark hair and a face round with baby fat. He's clutching a stuffed rabbit in one hand, the kind that's probably been chewed on, slept with, dragged through mud. His other hand trails along the edge of the trolley, sticky fingers brushing the metal bars. The mother is distracted. She's leaning into a freezer, rummaging through bags of frozen chips, her face set in frustration. The boy shifts in the trolley, squirming like he's about to climb out. She doesn't notice. I do. I walk past them once, just to be sure. My steps are quiet, unhurried. I glance at the boy, catching his eye for half a second. His gaze is wide and curious, the way young children are. He doesn't cry or call out, he just looks at me. The moment is brief, but it's enough. I continue down the aisle, turning left at the end and doubling back. I don't need to see them again. I know where they are, and I know what's coming next. The employee's only door isn't far. It's just around the corner from the frozen foods. Near the stockroom, I pause there, my hand resting lightly on the handle, and wait. My heart is steady, my breathing calm. I've done this before. It doesn't take long. The boy's mother leaves the trolley. She doesn't mean to, not really, but she's frustrated and trying to grab something off a high shelf. She's turned slightly away, her body between the trolley and the freezer. It's all the opening I need. I move quickly, not rushing, but with the ease of someone who belongs here. My hand brushes against the boy's arm and he looks up at me. I smile, nodding towards the door. He doesn't hesitate. He grabs his stuffed rabbit tighter and reaches for my hand, his tiny fingers warm and sticky as they curl around mine. The employee's only door is quiet when it closes behind us. The noise from the shop floor fades into a dull murmur. The air back here is different, cooler, the smell faintly industrial. Rows of shelves stretch into the distance, stacked with crates and cardboard boxes. The boy doesn't make a sound. He's looking around, wide-eyed, taking in the strange new space. I guide him down one of the aisles, moving further into the stockroom. There's a corner near the back where the cameras don't reach. I've checked. The racks are packed tightly here, the boxes piled high. I stop there, crouching down to the boy's level. He stares at me, clutching the rabbit against his chest. His mouth opens slightly, like he might ask a question, but then he glances over his shoulder, back towards the door we came through. Something changes in his face. It's subtle, a shift in the way his eyes dart to the edges of the room. His fingers tighten around the rabbit and his body stiffens slightly, like he's realized something isn't right. He looks back at me, and I see the flicker of fear starting to bloom behind his gaze. My hand moves towards him, gentle, reassuring, but he flinches. The rabbit drops to the floor, landing with a soft thud against the concrete. I don't make a sound as I reach for him. The stockroom is silent. Somewhere far off, the murmur of the shop floor drifts faintly through the walls. But back here, it's just us. The boy shifts, his tiny trainers scuffing against the ground, and his breath comes quicker now, shallow and fast. The air feels thick around us, like the silence has seeped into everything. For a moment, neither of us moves. Then there's a sound, a faint, distant creak of the employees-only door opening. It's soft, barely noticeable, but I freeze. The boy does too, his eyes widening as he looks past me towards the direction we came from. I don't move. The air feels colder now, the noise from the shop floor fading further away. Something's changed. I crouch lower, pressing myself into the corner, my body blocking the boy from view. His small frame trembles slightly, his hands gripping the edge of my vest. The sound of footsteps echoes faintly through the stockroom, slow and measured, growing softer, then louder again as if someone is pausing, listening. I stay perfectly still, my breath shallow, my eyes fixed on the gap between the shelves. The light shifts faintly, but I can't see anything. The boy shifts slightly behind me, his breath coming in quick bursts against the fabric of my vest. I don't look at him. My gaze stays locked on the aisle, waiting for movement, but nothing comes. The footsteps fade again, and the silence stretches out heavy and unbroken. I stood near the toy aisle, pretending to examine the rows of action figures and brightly colored boxes, my eyes just skimming the plastic surfaces. It was too noisy, too bright under the fluorescent lights, and yet it felt like there was a stillness underneath it all, the sort of quiet most people wouldn't notice unless they were really paying attention. I wasn't there for the toys. I had no reason to be there, really, except that I'd seen her the moment she came in. She had a boy with her, small, maybe 5 or 6. His trainers lit up every time he stomped his feet. He tugged at her hand, pulling her towards the displays as she tried to steer him through the aisles. She was young. Her hair was tied back, strands falling loose in that way that looked effortless, but probably wasn't. She carried herself like someone who had somewhere to be, but her movements weren't rushed. Confident, focused. She hadn't noticed me then. People rarely did. I know how to make myself less obvious. It's not something I learned, more something I just understood. How to blend into the edges of things, not draw attention. So when they turned down the toy aisle, I moved too, keeping enough distance to avoid being obvious. The boy darted from one shelf to the next, picking things up and putting them down without much care. His mother followed, her shoulders set in that way people have when they're trying to hold everything together. She knelt at one point to look at something he handed her. And that's when I noticed the way the fluorescent lights hit her face, the faint shadow under her eyes. She seemed tired, not just from shopping, but the kind of tired that sits in your bones, the kind you carry with you. I shifted slightly, stepping further into the aisle. Her head tilted in my direction then, just for a second before she turned back to her son. I think she noticed me. Even if only on the edges of her awareness, she stood, tugging her son's hand again, guiding him out of the aisle. I didn't follow immediately, not wanting to make it obvious. Instead, I moved to the next aisle over and waited. I knew where she'd go next. People have patterns, especially in places like this. She appeared at the far end of the aisle, scanning the shelves. The boy had a toy in his hand now, a small plastic car he was clutching tightly. She seemed distracted, glancing at the displays and then down at him, and then briefly over her shoulder. I stepped forward again, moving closer. I didn't have a plan. I never do, not really. It wasn't about doing anything. It wasn't even about her exactly. It was more like something I couldn't stop myself from doing, like scratching at an itch, seeing how close I could get before she noticed, seeing how much space I could take up in her world without her realizing. This time she noticed. Her head turned just slightly, enough that I could see the change in her posture. She reached for her son's hand, gripping it firmly now. She walked quickly towards the center of the store, and I followed, keeping just enough distance to blend in with the other shoppers. The bright open area near the tills wasn't ideal. Too many people, too many eyes. But I kept my pace steady, weaving through the crowd to stay behind her. She stopped briefly near the clothing section, glancing around like she was looking for something. Her hand tightened on the boy's shoulder, pulling him closer to her side. I stood by a display of winter coats, pretending to browse as I kept her in the corner of my vision. She was speaking to someone now, one of the employees in their blue vests. She gestured with her free hand, and the employee nodded, their expression shifting to something more serious. I moved further back, retreating into the racks of coats. From there, I could just see her and the employee heading towards the customer service desk. The employee was speaking into a radio now, glancing around the store as though trying to spot something or someone. It was time to leave. I knew that much. But as I turned to go, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. She was holding her son close, her eyes scanning the store. I could tell she felt me, even if she couldn't see me. That was enough. I slipped out through the side entrance, blending into the flow of shoppers heading to their cars. The cold air hit me as I stepped outside, but I didn't stop moving. I walked towards the far end of the car park where the light was dimmer and the spaces were mostly empty. When I reached my car, I didn't get in right away. I stood there for a moment, looking back at the store, at the bright windows and the figures moving behind them. I wondered if she'd forget about me once she got home, if the memory of me would fade into something distant and indistinct, or if it would stay with her, a faint itch at the edge of her thoughts. I didn't know, but I knew one thing: I wasn't done yet. The car park was dimly lit, the overhead lights sputtering faintly in the cold. I had parked farther out than usual, closer to the empty edge of the lot where the glow from the store didn't quite reach. The vastness of it struck me as I stepped outside, clutching my bag close. The sound of my shoes against the tarmac was sharp in the quiet, each step echoed faintly by the stillness of the evening. It wasn't late yet, but the lot had a kind of emptiness that made it feel later than it was. I had just passed the last row of closer spaces when I noticed him. He was standing by a car, a dark saloon with the bonnet slightly dusty, parked a few spaces over from mine. He had his hands shoved into the pockets of a jacket, and he gave the impression of someone who had been there for a while, waiting. I don't know why I noticed that detail, but something about the way he stood, casual but still, made it hard to ignore. He stepped forward as I walked past, his boots crunching against the gravel near the edge of the tarmac. I stopped just for a moment, startled by the movement, and that's when he gestured to me. His hand came out of his pocket, the motion quick but not threatening, and he pointed towards the road that curved away from the car park. His lips moved, but I couldn't make out what he said. I hesitated. He was holding a phone in one hand, and he raised it slightly as if to show me. The way he moved it, I could tell it was off. No light, no screen glowing in the dusk. He gestured again towards the road, making a motion like he was lost. For a second I felt sorry for him. A stranded motorist, maybe. It was cold and the air had that sharp bite that warned of frost coming later. But something about the way he didn't step closer, even when he clearly wanted my help, made my skin tighten. I gestured vaguely towards the road myself, trying to make it clear where the main road went without stopping. I didn't want to get too close. He didn't respond right away, just stood there, staring as though he hadn't quite understood. Then, after a moment, he smiled. It was a wide, toothy grin that didn't match the situation at all. It felt like he was testing it, like trying out a mask. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I didn't wait to see if he needed more help. I turned and headed toward my car, quickening my steps. The sound of his boots crunching against the gravel didn't come immediately, but when they did, the noise was unmistakable. I glanced over my shoulder once and saw him walking after me, his grin still fixed, his pace matching mine now. I reached into my bag, gripping my keys tight as I approached my car. My breathing was shallow and I couldn't stop myself from looking back again. He had moved closer, his steps closing the gap. The grin was still there, stretched unnaturally across his face. It was too broad, his lips pulling back too far, like it didn't fit the rest of him. The space between us felt small now, though I hadn't stopped walking. His boots on the gravel were louder in my head than anything else, and I realized I was gripping my bag so tightly that my fingers ached. When I reached my car, I fumbled for a moment, trying to unlock the door. My hands were trembling enough that the key scraped the metal before finding the lock. I opened the door and threw myself inside, slamming it shut with a jarring thud. The interior light flicked on for a brief moment, casting a pale glow that made the outside world feel darker. I locked the doors before I even started the engine, my breath loud in the enclosed space. I glanced up, expecting to see him standing there, maybe banging on the window or pressing his face against the glass. But he wasn't at my car. I scanned the lot, searching the spaces between the rows, but he was gone. The car he had been standing by earlier looked the same as before, untouched, the windows dark and empty. My fingers fumbled over the ignition and the engine stuttered to life. I reversed out of the space, the tires squealing slightly as I pulled away. I didn't look behind me again until I was halfway down the main road. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the car park was just a grey smear against the black horizon. I tried to focus on the road, on the yellow glow of my headlights bouncing off the hedgerows. The engine hummed steadily beneath me, and the road stretched out ahead, long and empty. But the feeling didn't leave me, the sensation of being followed. I checked the mirror again more than once, but there was nothing behind me, just darkness stretching on and on. It wasn't until I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine that I realized I was still gripping the keys so tightly my knuckles were white. The air felt colder somehow as I sat there staring at the front door of my house, the streetlights humming faintly in the stillness. The quiet was deafening, pressing in around me. When I stepped out of the car, I scanned the street. It was empty, no footsteps, no figures standing in the pale wash of the streetlights, nothing. But as I stood there, fumbling with the lock on my door, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was nearby, somewhere, just out of sight, grinning. The email from payroll landed in my inbox at 10:43 a.m. on a Wednesday. The subject line read, "Discrepancy? Unlisted employee." That alone was enough to make my stomach turn. Discrepancies meant audits, meetings, extra shifts, always a headache in the retail world. I clicked it open and scanned the message. It was brief. They'd flagged timesheets for someone named Chris D. The problem, they said, was that Chris D wasn't in the system. No tax records, no hiring paperwork, no employee file. Payroll wanted me to clarify their status. Were they seasonal, a contractor, an error in the system? I sat back in my chair, frowning at the screen. I didn't recognize the name. The store wasn't that big. I prided myself on knowing everyone who worked there, even the part-timers who came and went, but Chris D didn't ring a bell. I opened the scheduling app and searched the name. There it was, clear as day. Chris D listed for 3 shifts over the past week. Morning shifts. Mostly. That was strange. If they were a new hire, I'd have been the one to sign off on their onboarding. I checked the schedule again, this time going back further. 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6. Christie's name was scattered across the rota, sporadic but consistent. My stomach tightened as I stared at it. I couldn't place them at all. No face, no conversations, no memory of a new hire called Chris. I left my office and headed to the break room, where a few employees were finishing their lunches. I asked casually about Chris, keeping my tone light, but their answers were strange. One of them, a cashier named Lorna, said she'd spoken to Chris just the other day about a missing price gun. Another nodded, saying Chris usually worked mornings in the stockroom. Their descriptions didn't help much. Chris was apparently quiet, stayed busy, and just got on with things. They described someone who was nondescript, almost deliberately ordinary, and yet no one could recall anything concrete. Hair color, maybe brown, maybe blonde. Height, somewhere around average. I left the break room more confused than when I'd entered. In the stockroom, I sifted through the logbook, where employees signed in when they clocked into the back. There it was again. Chris D, scrawled in uneven handwriting, along with the times they'd worked. I flipped back through the pages, scanning the logs, and their name appeared week after week. But the handwriting didn't stay the same. It shifted almost subtly at first. The letters grew thinner in some entries, wider in others. The capital C tilted differently each time. It didn't look like it belonged to the same person. Not really. A cold, prickling sensation crawled up my neck as I shut the logbook and set it aside. I decided to check the security cameras. The CCTV room was cramped and smelled faintly of damp cardboard. The monitors hummed as I scrolled back through the footage from earlier that week, focusing on one of the morning shifts where Chris D was listed as working. I fast-forwarded through the hours, scanning the images on the screen for anyone out of place. Nothing. The stockroom was busy, employees moving crates, restocking shelves, chatting as they worked. But no one stood out. No one matched the vague descriptions I'd been given of Chris. I rewound again, this time focusing on a specific point where Lorna had said she'd spoken to them about the missing price gun. The footage showed her standing near the back wall, her head tilted slightly like she was speaking to someone just out of frame. Except there was no one there. Lorna spoke animatedly, gesturing towards a crate, then turned and walked off, still talking as though someone was following her. But the aisle was empty. My pulse quickened as I paused the footage and rewound further. Another timestamp, another shift. This time it was a stock associate named Sam. He'd mentioned working with Chris earlier in the week, stacking canned goods onto shelves. The camera footage showed him in the aisle, lifting boxes and unloading them onto the display. Occasionally he'd glance to the side, nodding or muttering like he was in conversation. But again, the space beside him was empty. I checked another day, and another. Each time it was the same. Employees interacting with someone who wasn't there, speaking to empty air as though they were completely unaware of the absence. I felt something twist in my chest as I leaned back in the chair, staring at the monitors. Christie didn't exist, at least not in the way I'd thought. I closed the footage and returned to the shop floor. The air felt heavier now, the fluorescent lights above buzzing faintly, casting long streaks of brightness across the aisles. I moved through the store, glancing at the faces of the employees as they worked. They all looked normal, going about their tasks like any other day. But in the corner of my eye, I caught something. Movement near the stockroom doors, a figure stepping through, just for a moment, before disappearing into the back. I walked towards it, my pulse hammering in my ears. The stockroom was quiet when I entered, the rows of shelves stretching into the dimly lit distance. I moved slowly down the aisle, my footsteps echoing faintly on the concrete floor. I don't know what I expected to find. At the far end of the stockroom, near the loading bay, something caught my attention. A crate had been knocked over, its contents spilling across the ground. Cans rolled lazily to a stop, the sound faint and hollow. There was no one there, but the air felt different somehow, charged with something I couldn't explain. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the overturned crate, my breath catching in my throat. I never found Chris, not really. The name disappeared from the rota after that week. The logbook entries stopped. When I asked the employees about them again, most seemed confused, like they couldn't quite recall who I was talking about. Only Lorna remembered, but even she seemed uncertain, her voice trailing off when I pressed her for details. I don't know who or what Christie was. Maybe I never will. But sometimes, late at night when I'm locking up, I think I hear footsteps in the stockroom. I never go back to check. The stockroom has always been a good place, quiet mostly, dim. There's no natural light back here, so I don't have to worry about the sun slanting in and giving me away. The ceiling buzzes faintly from the fluorescent bulbs, but the noise blends into the background after a while. The walls are high, stacked with pallets wrapped in plastic. Toiletries, canned goods, seasonal decorations no one wants anymore. The aisles between them are tight and the air smells faintly of cardboard and damp. It's perfect, I've been here long enough to know the patterns. The employees come and go, joking and swearing under their breath about the work. They move without looking around much. Most of them don't care about what they're doing. They just want to get through their shifts and go home. And no one ever checks the far corner where the floor slopes slightly, where the racks are packed so tightly together that you'd have to move half the room just to reach the walls. That's where I sleep. I've made a little nest there, tucked in behind stacks of oversized dog food bags. It's comfortable enough. I've got an old duvet I dragged in from behind the charity shop last winter, and I layered it with a few blankets I lifted from the clearance bin here months ago. The cold doesn't reach me when I'm back there. The sound doesn't either. It's easy to forget where I am, lying there in the dark. Getting food is simple. They don't notice if a tin of soup or a pack of biscuits goes missing now and then. There's so much stock passing through this place, it's like a river. No one sees every twig that floats by. I'm careful, though. I never take more than I need for the night. And I hide the wrappers deep in the rubbish bins. The key is to leave no trace, but something's changed recently. It started a few weeks ago. I can't pin down the exact day, but the air feels different when I'm moving through the aisles. It's not something I can explain properly, but I've been careful to listen for it. The employees stay later now, their steps heavier, their voices sharper. They seem restless. It's not a good sign. Last night I heard someone moving through the back aisles long after they should have gone home. It was quiet enough that it could have been my imagination, but I stayed completely still, wedged into my corner with the dog food pressing against my back. I didn't breathe. The sound was faint, dragging lightly over the concrete, but it didn't come closer. Eventually it faded and I forced myself to lie down again. Today is different. The lights are on longer than usual, and I can hear voices further back in the stockroom than I've ever heard them before. They're moving crates, pulling things off shelves, their steps echoing unevenly off the high walls. Something crashes to the ground, glass by the sound of it, and someone swears loudly. My stomach knots. I've never felt like this before here. The stockroom has always been safe. I keep telling myself that. It's safe. But they're close. I sit on my duvet, knees drawn to my chest, staring at the little gap between the shelves where the light filters through. It flickers slightly when people pass, their movements throwing off the glow. It shouldn't bother me, it's just light. But there's something off. The air feels colder than it should, and I swear I can hear something faint above the noise of the employees. It's soft, like the sound of fabric brushing against concrete, but when I crane my neck, the sound stops. It's probably nothing, I tell myself that. I don't sleep tonight. The next evening, the store feels quieter than usual. Even the workers seem subdued, their conversations dropping off as they drift in and out of the stockroom. I hear someone muttering near the far wall, their voice low but tense. The air feels tighter now, like there's less of it to breathe. When the store finally goes silent, I make my move. I need food. I'm down to the last of the biscuits I stashed under the blanket 2 nights ago, and I can't keep still without something to eat. I know the route by heart. The aisle between the dog food and the industrial cleaning supplies, the narrow corridor that leads out to the shop floor. It's always dark here, the lights set to low for the night shift. I don't make a sound as I creep out, sticking close to the shelves. The aisles feel longer tonight. I reach the tinned goods without a problem. My hands brush over the labels until I find what I need, a tin of beans. I grab a packet of crackers on my way back, quick, efficient. But when I turn to head back to my corner, I stop. There's someone standing at the end of the aisle. The silhouette is faint, half lit by the glow of the exit sign behind them. They're not moving, but I can feel them looking. My pulse pounds in my ears, and I duck into the next aisle, gripping the tin so hard my fingers ache. The stockroom isn't safe anymore. I wait in the dark until the sound of footsteps fades, but the silence that follows feels sharp, like something's pressing into my skin. I move back to my corner, slower this time, checking over my shoulder every few steps. The tin and crackers feel like anchors in my hands. When I get back to my spot, something's changed. The duvet has been moved. Not far, just enough that it's obvious. The blankets I tucked around the edges are slightly off, the edges trailing on the concrete. It's wrong. It's all wrong. I drop the tin and step back, my breath catching. The stockroom is silent again, but the silence feels heavier now. I don't sleep. I don't even sit. I crouch behind the dog food, staring at the aisle in front of me, every sound magnified in my head. The light flickers once. I don't move. The car park was practically empty, a few scattered vehicles sitting under the washed-out glow of the overhead lights. The edges of the lot faded into darkness, the kind that seemed to press in from the countryside surrounding the store. I was parked near the far end, not out of choice, but because, when I arrived earlier, it was the only space left. The woman was easy to spot as she left the store. She had that hurried pace people get when they're alone at night, clutching her bag close, keys already in hand. Her trainers squeaked faintly against the wet tarmac as she moved toward the row of cars, head down, focused. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, strands sticking out here and there, and she wore a puffer jacket zipped up to her chin. Ordinary, forgettable even, but she had caught my attention inside the store, and I wasn't going to let this moment slip away. I stepped out from where I'd been standing near the wall, holding the small, crumpled piece of paper in my hand. The receipt, it was greasy and torn, pulled from a bin by the tills. I'd smoothed it out as best I could, but the ink had smudged, and it didn't take much to see it wasn't hers. That wasn't the point, though. I called out to her as I approached, waving the receipt slightly to catch her attention. She didn't stop. Not immediately, but her steps faltered just enough for me to close the distance between us. I held the paper out, close enough for her to see it. She turned, her eyes darting from my hand to my face, her expression sharp with suspicion. She glanced back towards the store as though considering whether to return. I shook the receipt slightly, trying to make it clear that I wasn't going to leave until she acknowledged me. Her hesitation was brief. She said something. I couldn't hear the words, but her lips moved in protest, and she took a step back, shaking her head. Her shoulders hunched slightly, and I could see her fingers tightening around her bag strap. She turned away, quickening her steps toward her car. The way she ignored me lit a spark somewhere inside my chest, and without thinking, I followed her. The air was damp, carrying the faint smell of petrol and wet concrete, and my boots scraped against the ground as I matched her pace. She was parked 3 rows down, her car an old silver hatchback with a missing hubcap on one of the back wheels. She glanced over her shoulder as she walked, and I could see the flash of tension in her eyes when she realized I was behind her. She reached her car, fumbling with the keys, but her hands were shaking now, and it took her a moment to unlock the door. I stopped a few feet away, still holding the receipt. She looked at me again, her movements frozen, and I held it out once more insistently. She said something, quick, sharp, her tone rising slightly, but I wasn't interested in the words. My heart was pounding now, a dull thud in my chest, and I could feel a strange heat rising in me, like a pressure that needed to be released. She yanked the door open and threw herself inside, slamming it shut with a force that made the whole car shudder. I stepped closer, close enough to see her hands trembling as she jammed the key into the ignition. She twisted it, the engine coughing to life, and for a split second her eyes locked with mine through the glass. Her fear was plain now, written all over her face, and it filled me with something I couldn't quite name. Satisfaction, maybe, or something darker. I slapped the crumpled receipt against her window, pressing it against the glass hard enough that it stuck for a moment before falling to the ground. She flinched, her shoulders jerking, and the car lurched forward, tires squealing against the wet tarmac as she sped out of the car park. I stood there for a moment, staring after her as the taillights disappeared into the distance. My breathing was uneven, my hands trembling slightly as I clenched them into fists. The receipt lay crumpled at my feet, damp and dirty now, and I bent to pick it up, stuffing it into my pocket. The car park was silent again, empty except for the faint buzz of the overhead lights and the steady patter of water dripping from a nearby gutter. I turned and started walking back towards the store, my boots echoing faintly against the pavement. As I passed the spot where she'd parked, something caught my eye, a small object lying on the ground near the edge of the space. I crouched to pick it up, holding it up to the light. It was a single key, one of those cheap spare ones you get cut at kiosks. The metal was scratched and the plastic head was chipped at the edges. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the coldness of it against my skin. It didn't seem like much, just a small, insignificant thing, easy to lose and forget about. But as I stood there holding it, a strange, gnawing feeling settled in my chest. I slipped the key into my pocket alongside the receipt and walked away. The store is cold. Fluorescent lights stretch in long, clinical lines overhead, humming faintly. The air smells of stale popcorn from the snack counter, faint cleaning fluid and cardboard. This time of night, the place feels abandoned, like a ship adrift at sea. It's quiet, but not silent. There's always a faint, distant sound of boxes being unpacked, carts squeaking down aisles, the occasional crackle of the overhead speaker announcing a restock in frozen foods. That's why I like it here. Nobody pays attention. Nobody looks too closely. She works in the back half of the store, near the electronics section. Always midnight shifts, always looking tired but sharp, moving with a quick, focused sort of energy. She wears the navy blue uniform shirt tucked in neatly, even though most of her co-workers are sloppier. Her name tag says Emily in plain white block letters. There's nothing special about her, not in any way you'd notice right off the bat. But something about the way she carries herself makes it easy to keep watching. Not too obvious, never too obvious. The first night I saw her, she was standing by a pallet of shrink-wrapped televisions, scanning each barcode with one of those handheld scanners. Her ponytail swung a little as she worked, and I noticed she glanced over her shoulder every now and then like she thought someone might be there. She wasn't looking at me. Nobody looks at me. I take my time, moving between aisles. I don't push a cart. It draws too much attention if you're just wandering, not putting anything in. Instead, I pick up random things to hold while I walk, a jar of peanut butter, a pack of batteries, a single bulb of garlic. I make sure to put them back on different shelves. Nobody ever checks. The store's a mess anyway, like they've stopped bothering to keep track of what goes where during these shifts. She's predictable, in the way people tend to be. She starts her shift in one section, works her way through her assigned aisles, then disappears into the back room for a while. Always about the same amount of time. When she comes back out, she stops at the counter near the photo printing machines to jot something in a little black notebook. Maybe it's a list of tasks or a log she has to keep. I don't care what's in it. I care that I can follow her without her noticing. Some nights I stay until the end of her shift. That's when the store feels even emptier. A skeleton crew wheels carts of stock through the aisles, the automatic doors at the front sliding open now and then for a solitary customer. It's easy to watch her slip out through the side door by the loading docks, the one staff members use when they clock out. She walks quickly, like she doesn't want to linger in the lot. The parking lot's a good place for watching. There's a long row of sodium lights overhead that paint the cracked pavement in a sickly orange glow, but there are also plenty of shadows around the edges. The places where the cars are parked furthest from the building, left overnight waiting for morning shift workers to pick them up. That's where I stay, leaning on a car that isn't mine, or crouching behind the low concrete divider near the edge of the property. She drives a white compact car, nothing fancy. The left tail light has a spiderweb crack running through the red plastic. I noticed that the first night I followed her. She doesn't seem to notice much when she's heading out to a car. Maybe it's the lateness, or maybe it's just that she's used to it, the quiet of this part of town after midnight. But once she's in, she always locks her doors before she starts the engine. I can see her hand flicking over to hit the button. When she pulls out, I wait before starting my own car. I know better than to be obvious about it. I let her get some distance, then follow at a safe range. There's not much traffic at this hour, but it doesn't matter. The roads are wide and empty, and she doesn't speed or make sudden turns. She follows the same route every night, out of the lot, down the stretch of road lined with shut-down fast food joints and an all-night petrol station, then onto the residential streets. I keep my headlights off once I'm far enough behind. I know the route now. I know where the stop signs are, where she slows down to turn into her neighborhood. She lives in a small house, part of a row of nearly identical ones. All of them are dark except hers, where she flicks on the porch light as she pulls into the drive. That's when I stop. 2 houses down, just past the bend in the road where the street lamp doesn't quite reach. I cut the engine and sit, keeping low in my seat. I can see her stepping out of the car, the faint click of her boots on the driveway carrying through the still air. She glances around once, never behind her though. People never check behind. She goes inside, locks the door. The porch light stays on. Sometimes I wait until I see the light in her bedroom window go on. It's upstairs, second from the left. Other times I leave before that, but not tonight. Tonight I'm thinking about how easy it would be to get closer. The houses here don't have fences, and the neighbors don't seem to notice much. The one 2 doors down still has a Christmas wreath hanging on their door in February. The bedroom light switches on after a while, casting a yellow rectangle out onto the lawn. I can see her shadow moving across the window, crossing, pausing, bending slightly like she's setting something down on a table. Then the shadow vanishes, and I know she's moved out of sight. I think about getting out of the car. The night is cold, and the air will feel sharp in my lungs. It's quiet though, nobody will hear anything. The thought sits with me for a while. I watch the house, the porch light, the faint outline of her car in the drive. The light in her bedroom stays on. I don't move, not tonight.